The distress beacon was not mine to answer. I knew that. I read the frequency, checked the grid coordinates, ran the signal against my assignment parameters, and confirmed with complete clarity that it was not my sector, not my mission, and not my problem. I sat with that information for exactly 4 seconds. Then I punched in the coordinates and let the fold drive spin up, because 4 seconds is about as long as I need to make a decision I already know I am going to live with. My name is Devan Cole, Sergeant, United Nations Expeditionary Corps. Detached assignment, Sector 9 Outer Perimeter. Detached is the word command used. What it meant, practically, was that someone back at headquarters had needed a body in a position that was too far out and too low priority for anyone with options to volunteer for, and I had been the body available. That was 211 days ago. I had stopped counting at around day 60, because counting made the silence feel like something you were supposed to do something about, and I had made peace with the silence by then. The beacon was broadcasting on a V3 diplomatic frequency. I knew enough about the V3 to know what that meant. The V3 Compact was the oldest and most powerful civilization in this sector of the galaxy. They were elegant, precise, deeply intelligent, and they had been at war with the Kreth swarm for longer than my species had been writing things down. Their ships were beautiful. Their military doctrine was sophisticated. Their understanding of tactical withdrawal was so refined that they had 14 separate words for the different kinds of retreat, each one carrying its own strategic meaning. They did not have a word for holding a position when the numbers were against you. I had checked. Early on, when I had too much time and the ship's translation database for company, I had gone looking for the V3 equivalent of that concept. Stand your ground, hold the line, die before you give an inch. There was no phrase for it. Not because the V3 were afraid. They were not afraid. It was simply that, in 10,000 years of survival, the concept had never been necessary enough to name. The beacon told me the diplomatic transport had lost its escort, had 2 functional engines out of 4, and was caught between converging Kreth assault wings closing from opposite approach vectors. The signal was calm, professionally transmitted, the kind of distress call that had been carefully formatted to convey maximum information with minimum panic. Whatever V3 crew members sent it had done so with the discipline of someone who had accepted the situation and was reporting it accurately rather than emotionally. I found that admirable. I also found it sad, in a way I did not examine closely while I was already spinning up the drives. My ship was a UN Scout-class corvette, designation EC-7 Halcyon. She was not a warship in any serious sense of the word. She was lightly armed, fast in short bursts, and had hull plating that had been repaired in at least 9 places, with materials that were not the original specification. Those 9 repairs had names, in my head, not the ships that caused them, the situations, the moments. You spend 211 days alone, and you end up naming things that should not have names, just so the silence has some furniture in it. I dropped out of fold space at Grid 7 into a situation that was precisely as bad as the beacon had described, which meant it was worse than that in practice, because beacons describe the situation as it was when the signal was sent, and situations have a way of developing. The transport was visible on my screen, a mid-size V3 diplomatic vessel, graceful even damaged, trailing atmosphere from a breach in her rear section. She was not moving. She was holding position because she had no better options, sitting in the open space between 2 closing formations, like something that had given up on running, and was simply waiting to see what came next. The Kreth formations were larger than I had estimated from the beacon data. 2 full assault wings, 17 ships in the first, 22 in the second, both moving in the tight, coordinated patterns that the swarm used when they had already assessed a target as non-threatening. They were not rushing, they were arriving, the way something arrives when it already knows what it is going to find. I ran the numbers in about 3 seconds, not because the numbers were complicated, because I wanted to make sure I was reading them correctly before I decided they did not matter. My comms opened on the transport's frequency. A voice came through, clipped and formal, the V3 translator rendering it into serviceable English with a slight harmonic undertone that their language always carried. Unknown vessel, this is the V3 diplomatic transport Sail Vin's Grace. You have dropped into an active engagement zone. We strongly advise immediate departure on any available vector. We cannot guarantee your safety if you remain. I checked to see if there was a polite V3 phrase for what I was about to say. There wasn't, so I used my own. Sit tight. I am working. There was a pause. 4 seconds, roughly, which I was starting to think was a universal unit of time for processing information that didn't fit existing categories. Unknown vessel. We count 39 Kreth assault craft in 2 converging formations. Your vessel class is a UN scout corvette. We are, another pause, shorter, advising retreat. I heard you the first time, I said. Sit tight. I closed the channel, because I needed both hands and all of my attention for what came next, and also because there was nothing else to say. The Kreth formations had registered my arrival. I watched their approach angles shift slightly, the way a predator's attention shifts when something new enters its peripheral vision. Not alarmed, just updated. I was a new data point. They were calculating what to do with me. I gave them something easier to calculate. I flew directly into the gap between the 2 wings. Not toward them, not angling for engagement on favorable terms. Directly into the middle, into the single worst position on the tactical board, the point of maximum exposure, where both formations would have clean firing solutions on my ship simultaneously. It was the last place any commander with options would go. It was, for that exact reason, the only place I could go that would make both wings change their calculation. The Kreth swarm were not unintelligent. They had beaten civilizations that were, by most measures, smarter and better equipped than humanity. But they were predators, built by millions of years of evolutionary pressure into something that processed the universe in a specific way. They responded to threat assessment. They moved toward things that registered as prey and away from things that registered as danger. The mechanics of that system were elegant, and, if you had enough time, and enough combat data, and enough lonely nights with nothing to do but study it, exploitable. I had exploited it. In month 4, alone in Sector 9 with nothing happening, I had spent 3 weeks going through every piece of combat data the UN Expeditionary Corps had logged on Kreth engagements, not looking for patterns in how to defeat them, looking for patterns in how they flinched. Every predator has a threshold, a point where prey behavior crosses into something that triggers a different response. The Kreth had one. They had just never encountered anyone willing to find it from the inside. The first shots came from the right-hand formation. I was already moving, not away, sideways, cutting across the closing angle, firing on the lead elements of the left-hand wing, because the math said the left wing was slightly faster and needed to be persuaded to slow down first. I took 2 hits on the starboard plating. The ship shuddered the way she shuddered, familiar, like a complaint rather than a crisis. I filed it away and kept moving. The thing about fighting the way I fought was that it required a specific relationship with the concept of being hit. Most military doctrine, across every species I had studied, was built around the idea that being hit was a failure state, something to be avoided, planned against, minimized, shields, evasion, range maintenance. All of it was architecture built to keep damage from reaching you. It was good doctrine. It worked. I did not argue with it. I just could not always afford it. When you were 1 ship against 39, evasion was a budget you ran out of fast. Taking a hit was not ideal. But a hit you survived was information the enemy was processing, and while I spent the Halcyon's hull integrity the way you spent currency, when you had exactly enough for 1 purchase, and needed to make it count, I made it count. On the transport's bridge, I did not know yet what they were watching. I found out later. I found out that the Cathara Guard, the 4 elite warriors assigned to protect the princess, had positioned themselves around the viewport screens and stopped moving. That their commander, a man named Tail who had fought for 40 years across 12 campaigns, had said something quiet to the room that none of them repeated to me directly. That the youngest guard, a fighter named Vane, had asked a question that nobody answered, because nobody in that room had an answer. What he asked was, why isn't it trying to win? The first wing broke at the 18-minute mark. Not all of it. 7 ships peeling off from the formation's rear, the Kreth version of a tactical reassessment, which in practice meant the calculation had shifted from easy acquisition to uncertain cost, and the uncertain cost was the part they didn't like. The rest of the wing held, because the swarm was hierarchical and the forward elements hadn't updated yet, but the break at the rear was the crack I needed. I went through it. The second wing took longer. They were better positioned, their angles cleaner, and they had the advantage of watching the first engagement and adapting. The Halcyon caught 3 more hits in the next 11 minutes, the worst of them going through the rear weapons array, and leaving me with 1 forward cannon and the secondary systems that required manual targeting, because no automated system could fire them fast enough to be useful. I fired them manually. The second wing broke at the 31-minute mark. Not completely, not cleanly. 5 ships stayed on intercept heading until I got a clean shot on the lead element, and then they reassessed, with a speed that suggested the lead element had been the only thing holding the calculation together. The Halcyon drifted. 2 hull breaches venting atmosphere from sections I had already sealed off. 1 engine running on what I could only describe as optimism and mechanical stubbornness. Forward cannon at 40%. Secondary systems hot and complaining about it through every warning light on the panel. I opened comms. "Anyone need a tow?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the translator rendered a voice, formal and precise, and carrying something underneath the formality that I could not quite name yet. "Unknown vessel. Please identify yourself and state your condition." My condition was several things I did not feel like listing in order. I gave them the relevant part. "Sergeant Davin Cole, UN Expeditionary Corps. My ship needs about 6 hours of work and a conversation with someone who knows hull sealant. Your transport looked like it had a bay I could dock with, if that's all right." Another pause. Shorter. "The bay is open, Sergeant Cole," the voice said. "We will meet you at the airlock." I set the docking approach and leaned back in the pilot seat for the first time in 31 minutes. My hands were very steady on the controls. They had been steady the whole time. They were shaking now, just slightly, the way they always did after, when the body caught up with what had happened and put in its complaint. I let them shake. I had long since stopped being embarrassed about it. You did the thing, then you shook. That was the order of operations, and the shaking was just the tax. I paid it and started the docking approach, and thought about nothing much at all. The airlock opened onto a corridor that smelled like something between cedar and rain, which was apparently what V3 atmospheric processors defaulted to, and I filed that detail away next to all the other details I had been filing away for 211 days, because that was what happened when you spent long enough alone. Everything became worth noting, just to have something to think about later. There were 5 of them waiting. 4 in armor, 1 not. The 4 in armor were the Cathara Guard, and I knew what they were before anyone told me because of how they stood. There is a specific way that serious fighters hold themselves in uncertain situations, a quality of attention that looks like stillness but is not stillness at all. It is readiness wearing stillness as a coat. I recognized it because I probably looked the same way. The 4 of them had positioned themselves in a pattern that covered every angle from me to the 5th figure, and they had done it so naturally that it looked like they had simply chosen comfortable places to stand. The 5th figure was the princess. I am not going to spend a lot of words on how she looked. She was tall by human standards, with the silver-tinted complexion that V3 biology produced in the low-gravity conditions of their home system, and dark eyes that were doing something very active and precise, which was that they were examining me the way you examine a piece of equipment you have never seen before and are trying to determine the function of. She was wearing something that managed to be both practical and formal, which I suspected was a skill she had spent considerable time developing. She stood in the way that people stand when they have been trained from childhood to make their body language carry information. All the information her body language was currently carrying said, "I am the one in charge here, and I am deciding what to make of you." I had been decided about by aliens before. It was a different quality of scrutiny than humans brought to it. Humans who looked at you that carefully were usually looking for something specific, a threat assessment, an attraction assessment, a status calculation. V3, from what I had read, were looking for your category, where you fit in the framework they use to understand things. It was not a hostile look. It was something closer to a scientist's look, which, depending on your feelings about being examined, could go either way. I didn't mind it. I had been alone long enough that being looked at by anyone, for any reason, felt like contact. The tallest of the 4 guards stepped forward. He had the bearing of someone who had been important for so long that it had settled into his bones. 40 years of fighting, I found out later. He carried it the way some people carry experience, not like weight, like bedrock. His name was Tail. He told me that in V3 first, then repeated it in English, with the careful pronunciation of someone who had been practicing with a translation database. The detail stuck with me more than I expected. "Sergeant Cole," he said, "on behalf of Her Highness Sail Vin, third heir of the V3 Compact, I extend formal gratitude for your intervention." A pause. "I also have questions. You can ask them while I find your hull sealant," I said. "My ship has 2 leaks, and one of them is in a section I would prefer to stop losing." That was not quite how V3 formal conversations were supposed to go, I gathered, from the slight shift in Tail's expression. Not offense, more the expression of a man recalibrating what kind of conversation this was going to be. "Of course," he said. "Follow me." I followed him. The other 3 guards fell in at distances that maintained their coverage pattern, without making it obvious they were maintaining a coverage pattern. I noticed it, and did not mention it. It was good work. The princess walked ahead, not with us, not separated, simply at the front, in the way that people walk when walking at the front is the natural order of things for them. The bay they gave me access to was well equipped for a diplomatic transport, which meant it was better equipped than anything I had worked with in about 6 months. I found the hull sealant in the 3rd cabinet I checked, which felt like a small victory, and started running down the repair list in my head, while Tail positioned himself nearby, with the patience of a man who had learned that waiting was a skill worth developing. "The debrief," he said, after I had been working for about 2 minutes. "If you are willing." "Go ahead." "Your tactical approach," he said. "We observed it from the transport screens. We have reviewed the engagement record twice since you docked." A pause that felt deliberate. "We would like to understand your planning process." I thought about how to answer that. I am not being false when I say the honest answer felt too simple to be a satisfying answer, but I had been alone long enough to have stopped dressing up simple answers. "I saw the angles," I said. "I got in the middle. I made it their problem." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that means someone received information, and the information did not fit where they were trying to put it. "There was no," Tail said carefully, "modeling of survival probability?" "Of course there was." "And?" "Low," I said. I heard him breathe in, a controlled breath, the kind you take when you are managing a reaction. "You assessed your survival probability as low," he said, "and engaged anyway. Someone needed help. I had weapons. I found the second breach. Started prepping the sealant compound. The math past that felt like someone else's problem." The sound that came from behind Tail, from the direction of the other guards, was short and controlled, the kind of sound that happens when someone has a reaction they immediately decide not to have in front of their commanding officer. I did not look up from my work. Tail said, very quietly, something in V3 that my translator did not catch completely. What it rendered was approximately, "There is no threshold." What I found out later, from Vane, who told me this with the expression of someone still processing it 3 days after the fact, was that what Tail had said to the others was, "Find the human's survival threshold in the literature. I will wait." And that no one had been able to find it. Because it was not in there, not because no one had looked. Because the data on human military engagements that the V3 Compact had collected over the years of cautious contact consistently failed to produce a reliable lower limit. There were human soldiers who had held positions against odds that no V3 tactical model predicted they should survive. There were human accounts of individuals making decisions that, by every rational framework, represented the wrong calculation. And the infuriating thing, from a data analysis perspective, was that those decisions kept working often enough that they could not be classified as errors. They were outcomes. Messy, painful, expensive outcomes, but outcomes. I did not know any of this while I was fixing my hull. I was thinking about the second breach, and whether the sealant compound I had found was the right grade for the plating material. The quiet one among the guards, the eldest, whose name I learned was Seth, moved from his position near the wall after about 20 minutes, and stood near the repair area. Not close enough to be in my way, close enough to be present. I registered it, and continued working. At the 30-minute mark, he handed me a tool I was reaching for, before my hand got there. I looked at it. Looked at him. He looked at the hull plating with the expression of a man who had not done anything worth commenting on. I went back to work. He handed me the next one, too. We did not speak. We did not need to. The princess appeared at the entrance to the bay when I was about 40 minutes into the repair. I felt her before I saw her. which sounds dramatic, but was actually just basic situational awareness, responding to a shift in the room's attention. The guards noticed her. When people who are watching everything notice the same thing, that thing is worth noticing. She walked in with the same quality she had at the airlock, purposeful, measured, carrying her authority without performing it. She stopped at a distance that was close enough to be a conversation, and far enough to be a question. "Sergeant Cole," she said. "Your Highness, I have a question." Her English was more careful than Tails, each word placed with precision, like someone navigating a path they had studied on a map and were now walking for the first time. "When you flew into the center of the engagement zone, between the two formations, yes, what did you feel?" I thought about that. She waited, which was something I appreciated. A lot of people ask questions and then start worrying about the silence before the answer has had time to form. "Calm," I said, finally. She waited to see if there was more. "I know that sounds wrong," I said. 39 ships. Low probability numbers. It should have felt like panic, but the decision was already made by the time I got there. When the decision is made, you stop feeling the fear and start doing the work. The fear comes back later. "Later," she said. "After. When there's time for it." She looked at my hands. I was holding a sealant tool. My hands were steady. They had stopped shaking about 20 minutes after docking, which was faster than usual. I noted that without examining the reason for it. "Your people," she said. "All of them. They feel this way? About combat? Some of them." I considered it more carefully. The ones that last. She was quiet for a moment. Seth handed me a fastening pin without being asked, and I used it, and the sound of it clicking into place was the only thing in the bay for a few seconds. "We have a word," she said, "in Vaythri, for the kind of fear that makes you run, and a word for the kind that makes you still, and a word for the kind that makes you calculate. We have many words for fear." "That makes sense," I said. "We do not have a word," she said carefully, "for the kind that makes you fly into the middle." I looked at her. She looked back, and the examining quality in her eyes had changed. It was still precise. It was no longer categorizing. "Maybe that one doesn't need a word," I said. She considered that for longer than I expected. Then she nodded. Once, the slight formal Vaythri nod that the translation database told me was agreement delivered with respect, and walked back to the corridor. The guards shifted, and Tail followed her, and then Vane, and then the guard whose name I had not learned yet. Keth stayed. He handed me the next fastening pin, and I used it, and neither of us said anything at all, and I thought about how 211 days was a very long time, and about how the thing about silence is that the quality of it changes completely, depending on what is in the room with you. The hull repairs took the full 6 hours I had estimated. Seth was there for 4 of them. He did not talk much. He did not need to. He had the quality that very experienced soldiers sometimes develop, a capacity for presence that did not demand anything from you, that simply added weight to the room in a way that felt like company, rather than observation. I had met maybe 3 humans in my life with that quality. I had not expected to find it here, in a Vaythri guard on a damaged diplomatic transport in the middle of a grid I was not supposed to be in. When the repairs were done, he looked at the hull section I had finished, the way a craftsman looks at completed work, assessing it without flattery or criticism, just measuring it against what it needed to be. Then he nodded, the same nod the princess had used, and walked toward the corridor. At the doorway he stopped, did not turn around, said something in Vaythri that my personal translator, which was running off my suit rather than the ship's system, rendered imperfectly. It came out as approximately, "You work well alone, this is rare." I wanted to tell him it was not a choice, that working well alone was something you built out of not having alternatives, the way you build strength in a muscle, by using it too much for too long. But he was already gone, and the thought felt too large for the corridor, so I left it where it was, and went to check on the Halcyon's engine, which was running on optimism, and needed to be running on something more reliable before we were done. Outside, through the transport's hull, the stars were quiet. The Kreth formations were gone, pulled back to whatever the swarm did when it retreated to recalculate, which based on my data took between 8 and 20 hours depending on how badly the engagement had disrupted their hierarchy. We had a window, not a large one. I worked on the engine, and thought about the princess's question, and about the word they did not have. And I thought that sometimes the things that don't have names yet are the most important things. We just haven't been in the same room long enough to name them. The transport's emergency lighting was still cycling on a repair mode pattern, which meant the corridor outside the engine bay pulsed a soft amber every 30 seconds. It was the kind of light that made everything look like it was underwater, slow and amber, and blurred at the edges. I had been working for 9 hours straight by the time Tail appeared in the doorway, and the amber light made him look like something carved from old stone. "Her Highness requests your presence," he said, "when your work permits." I set down the coupling I was holding. "Now is fine." He walked me through the transport in the particular way that escort differs from accompaniment. Not aggressive, not deferential, simply present in a way that oriented the space, made clear without words who was moving, and who was facilitating the movement. 40 years of guard work, I thought. The body learns things that the mind stops tracking. The room he brought me to was the transport's forward observation area, a curved space at the nose of the ship with a viewport that ran the full width of the bow. Through it, the stars were exactly what stars are, indifferent and very beautiful. The princess was standing with her back to the door, looking at them. She did not turn when we entered. Tail positioned himself near the wall and became furniture in the way that excellent guards do. "Sergeant Cole," she said, without turning. "Sit, please." There was one chair. I sat in it. "I have been reading your species' military history," she said, still looking at the viewport. "The V3 Compact has maintained limited diplomatic contact with Earth for 41 years. In that time, our researchers have compiled a significant body of documentation on human military doctrine, conflict history, and tactical philosophy." A pause. "I have not read it before tonight." "Find anything interesting?" "I found it very difficult to understand," she said, which from the tone was not a complaint, but an honest statement of fact. "Not the events. The events are clear. The reasoning behind the events is what I struggled with." She turned then, and the amber light made her face difficult to read, which I suspected was not an accident. "Your people have fought each other, throughout your history, with a consistency and a cost that no external analysis would justify. The resources spent, the outcomes produced. By rational calculation, most of your largest conflicts should not have started, and nearly all of them should have ended earlier than they did." "That's probably accurate," I said. "What I could not identify," she said, "was what variable the rational calculation was missing, what your people were accounting for that the external analysis was not." She looked at me directly, and in the amber light those precise, measuring eyes had something new in them that I took a moment to identify. It was the look of someone who had spent time with a question and arrived at an answer they were not certain they had permission to believe. "I think I understand it now, after today." I waited. "You do not calculate survival as the objective," she said. "You calculate it as a parameter, one factor among several, and the other factors, the ones your people weight heavily enough to override survival, are the ones that cannot be quantified from outside." She paused. "Is that correct?" I thought about the 4 seconds before I punched in the coordinates for Grid 7. I thought about what I had felt in those 4 seconds, which was not fear, and not courage, and not calculation. It was something simpler than all of those. "Someone needed help," I said, "and I was the one who could help. Everything past that is details." She was quiet for a long moment. "My guards," she said, finally, "would say the same thing. They would say it as a statement of professional obligation, of trained duty. They protect me because it is their function, and they have developed their capability to serve that function. The dedication is real, the courage is genuine, but the starting point is the function." She looked at me with an expression that was not quite puzzlement, and not quite wonder, something between the two. "Your starting point was a frequency on a beacon you were not assigned to monitor, in a grid that was not your responsibility, for people you did not know and had no obligation to." "I had weapons," I said. "You needed help." "Yes," she said. "That is what I cannot fit into a model." She turned back to the viewport. "In V3 strategic philosophy, we have a concept, the weight of action. Every decision to act carries a weight proportional to the cost and the obligation. You act when the obligation equals or exceeds the cost. When it does not, you conserve your capacity for when it will." She touched the viewport glass, one hand flat against it. You acted with a very high cost, and an obligation that was, by our framework, effectively zero. A stranger's beacon, a foreign species, a battle that was not yours. The obligation was not zero, I said. She looked at me over her shoulder. People were going to die, I said. That is always an obligation, maybe not a legal one, maybe not one a court would recognize, but if you can do something, and you choose not to, that is a decision. I made a different one. The amber light pulsed. In the pulse, something shifted in her face, and then the next pulse came and it was composed again. But the thing I had seen in the space between was something unguarded, something that was responding to what I had said, in a way that was not regal, and not diplomatic, and not calculated. She looked like someone who had been handed a piece of vocabulary they had not known they were missing. Sergeant Cole, she said. Devon is fine. A very slight pause. Devon. She said it carefully, the way she had said the English words earlier, testing the weight of it. I would like to ask you something that is outside the normal range of diplomatic conversation. Go ahead. Are you afraid now? I looked at my hands. Steady. Had been steady since roughly 4 hours into the hull repair. Not right now, I said. Earlier, yes, after the fight, when I docked. The hands shake. They always do after. I saw, she said. I was watching from the bay entrance when you came through the airlock. Before you saw me. I had not known that. I filed it somewhere I was not ready to look at yet. The shaking is not a weakness, she said. It was not phrased as reassurance. It was phrased as a conclusion she had reached independently, and was now stating. In Vaethri culture, a warrior who does not feel the cost of what they have done is considered poorly calibrated. The feeling is the evidence of correct understanding. A pause. But we express it differently. We would not shake. We would perform a specific ritual of acknowledgement, a formal recognition that a significant thing has occurred. Shaking is my ritual, I said. That landed differently than I expected, in that she made a sound, short and quiet, that the translator did not attempt to render because it was not a word. But I recognized it. It was the sound of someone who found something genuinely, unexpectedly funny, and was not sure that laughing in this context was the correct response, but the response came anyway. It was a better sound than I had heard in 211 days. She controlled it quickly, which I respected, but she did not pretend it had not happened, which I respected more. The Cathara Guard, she said, back to her formal register, but with something slightly warmer underneath it now. We'll be filing individual reports on today's engagement. Tail will file a command-level tactical analysis. It will be read by the Compact Security Council within 48 hours of our return to Vaethri space. She turned fully from the viewport and looked at me with a directness that she had not used yet, not the measuring look from the airlock, not the thoughtful look from the bay, a direct look, the kind that precedes a statement of importance. What would you like those reports to say about you? I thought about that. The truth, I said, whatever that ends up being. She nodded, slowly, the formal nod that meant agreement with respect, but held longer than before. Then the truth it is, she said. Good night, Devan. She walked past me, past Tail, into the corridor. Her footsteps made almost no sound, the soft Vaethri footwear on the transport's flooring. And then she was gone, and the room was just amber light and stars, and Tail near the wall, who was looking at me with the expression of a man running a calculation. She has not used a person's given name in a professional context, Tail said. In the 6 years I have been her guard. I did not have a response to that. I sat with it for 4 seconds. Then I told Tail I was going to get some sleep before the engine needed another check, and I walked back through the amber light to the bay, and I sat on the floor of the Halcyon for a while, and I thought about the word she did not have yet. The one for the thing that made you fly into the middle. I thought maybe I did not have it either. In English. I thought maybe I did not have it either, maybe it was just a direction. The direction you went when someone needed you to. I lay down on the floor, because the bunk felt too far away, and I was asleep in about 45 seconds, which was also faster than usual. I woke up, because the proximity alert was talking to me. Not the loud one, the quiet one. The one set to passive detection, the low-priority ping that registered contacts at long range and asked me to look at them, rather than screaming about them. I had set that alarm to be quiet, because the loud one had a bad effect on my nervous system, and I had been alone for 211 days, with no one to calibrate myself against. I looked at the display from the floor, checked the data, checked it again. The Kreth had come back. This was not surprising. I had estimated 8 to 20 hours based on historical disruption and return patterns. It had been 11 hours, right in the middle of the range, which meant this particular swarm element was averaging and not exceptional, which was the most useful kind of information to have about a thing that was about to try to finish what it had started. What was different this time was what they had sent. I sat up and looked at it properly. 6 ships, not a wing, not a formation, a Sunder-class hunter pack. I had read about Sunder packs. They existed in the literature as a theoretical response to threat categories that standard swarm doctrine could not process efficiently. 6 ships, highly maneuverable, designed not to overwhelm a target with numbers, but to match it on its own terms, and exceed it on every relevant axis. The Kreth built them, and almost never deployed them, because almost nothing in their operational history had ever required them. They had apparently decided that yesterday had been a sufficient reason. They had built a hunter for the kind of thing I was. I held that thought for a moment, because there was something in it that I could not decide whether to find flattering or alarming, and I concluded that the distinction was not currently useful. I opened comms to the transport. Tail answered before the second pulse, which meant he had also been awake and watching, probably for the last several hours. "We see them," he said. "I know what they are," I said. A pause. "As do we. Keep the princess in the central compartment, away from the hull sections. Tell your guards to stay on her." I was already at the pilot controls, running the engine status. Better than last night. Not perfect. "I will handle the pack." The silence that followed was longer than 4 seconds. Long enough that I had time to run a weapons check and start calculating approach angles. "Sergeant Cole," Tail said. "Devan." The name came out carefully, the way he had heard the princess say it, testing it the same way. Sunder packs are designed to counter irregular combat behavior. They will not respond the same way the wings did. They have studied what you did. "I know." "The odds of a single ship." "I know," I said again. He was quiet. "I fought 2 wings," I said. "I still have weapons. Your guards know where to stand." I closed the pre-flight check. The engine sounded like it was trying its best, which was all any of us were doing. "Sit tight," I heard him breathe. Then, "We will be watching." "I know that too," I said. I undocked and took the Halcyon out into the space between the transport and the approaching pack, and I thought about Seth handing me tools without being asked, and about the sound the princess had made when something struck her as funny, and about the word that did not exist yet. The pack spread as I approached. They were good. They moved with the intelligence of something that had been specifically designed and specifically tasked. None of the formation instinct that made the wings predictable. 6 ships, 6 independent threat vectors, each one adjusting based on my position and the positions of the others. They were not trying to herd me. They were trying to close every direction at once. I picked the worst of the 6 angles and flew straight at it. The pack adapted faster than the wings had. That was the point of them. Whatever I did, they would have seen something like it before, or been built to account for it. The first pass cost me a hit I did not fully absorb, and I felt the ship stagger in a way she had not staggered yesterday. Something in the left drive coupling taking damage that was not on the right side of the maintenance threshold. I filed it and kept moving. The Sunder pack was excellent. That was the honest assessment. They were the best thing the Kreth had sent at me yet. Every feint I ran, they had a counter for it. Every position I tried to exploit, they closed within 2 beats. I was faster than they expected on the manuals, because the manuals on the Halcyon were calibrated to my hand specifically after 200 days of solo flying, and I knew them the way you know a thing you have spent too long alone with. That was my edge. Small, but real. I spent it very carefully. On the transport, I found out later, the guard had gone quiet. Vane had stopped narrating around the 4th minute, when it became clear that this was a different kind of engagement than yesterday. Tighter, and more dangerous, and less theatrical. Keth had moved to the viewport, and stood there with his arms loose at his sides, the posture he used when he was watching something, and could not look away. The princess had pressed both hands flat against the observation glass. Not one, both. At the 8-minute mark, I had taken out 2 of the 6. One cleanly, one messy. The messy one costing me a full systems flicker that lasted 3 seconds and felt like being underwater. When the lights came back up, I had 2 sunder ships in positions that should have been lethal, and were not because I had used the 3 seconds to drift into a geometry that neither of them could have planned for without knowing exactly how I thought, and they did not know that yet. They were learning it, but learning takes time. At the 14-minute mark, it was 4 against 1, and the Halcyon was down to secondary weapons only, the forward cannon offline from the flicker, the hull integrity in the rear quarter described by the display in terms I was translating in real time as, "This is very serious." I went manual on all of it. Manual targeting, manual thrust, manual everything. The Halcyon was not built for that. She was built with automated systems, because automated systems are faster and more reliable, and do not make decisions based on the particular quality of calm that shows up when you have already made the decision that gets you killed. I made several decisions in the next 6 minutes that the automated systems would not have made. The pack broke at the 20-minute mark. Not because I defeated them cleanly, because 3 were gone, 1 was badly damaged and pulling out of the engagement, and the remaining 2 ran the math on a target that had taken everything they had and was still maneuvering, and concluded that the math had changed in a direction they had not been built to account for. They retreated. I sat in the pilot's seat for a moment after they were clear. Then I docked. The airlock opened, and I stepped through, and I did not make it past the inner door before my legs decided that the floor was a reasonable destination. I sat down on the floor of the airlock junction, with my back against the wall, and my hands were shaking with a thoroughness that yesterday's version had not achieved. The guard was there, all 4 of them, Tail and Ven, and the 4th guard whose name I had not learned yet, and Seth, who had apparently moved from the viewport to the airlock during the final minutes of the engagement, without anyone telling me. Seth sat down near me, not touching, near. Tail crouched, lowering himself to my eye level, which was a V3 gesture I recognized from the translation database as a deliberate act of equality, the physical statement that says I am not above you in this moment, and I want you to hear what I say, as one person to another. "Why," he said quietly, "did you protect her?" My hands were still shaking. I watched them for a second. "Why wouldn't I?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. The amber light was gone. The transport had fixed its repair mode cycle sometime while I was asleep, and the corridor lighting was white and clean and made everything look like what it was, rather than what the atmosphere suggested. "We are nothing to you," he said. "We were strangers, a foreign species, a conflict that did not belong to your sector or your assignment. The obligation was not 0, I said. I had said this to the princess the night before, and it was still true this morning, in a way that felt more, rather than less true, for having been said out loud. People were going to die. I had weapons. The rest of it is just details." Tail held my eye contact for longer than was comfortable, and then nodded, once, the formal nod, and stood, and stepped back, and behind him the princess was standing in the corridor entrance. I had not heard her come in. I did not know how long she had been there. I did not know how much she had heard. She looked at me sitting on the floor with my hands shaking in my lap, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment that felt like it had a specific weight to it. Then she walked forward, past Tail, past Keth, past all of it, and crouched down in front of me the same way Tail had, level, direct, one person to another. She had something in her hand, a V3 medical kit, small, the kind carried as standard issue on diplomatic vessels. She opened it and took out something that looked like a bandage, that was not a bandage. "Your left hand," she said. I had not noticed the cut. I looked at it. It was not serious. Something in the final manual work, probably the targeting controls, which had sharp edges, I had been meaning to file down for about 30 days. She took my left hand and applied the V3 medical strip to the cut with the careful focus of someone who had been trained in field medicine and was applying that training to something smaller than it had been designed for, and doing it properly anyway. "You are shaking," she said. "I know. That means you were afraid." "Yes." She finished with the cut. She did not let go of my hand immediately. She held it for a moment, looking at it, and then she looked at me. "You chose anyway," she said. It was not quite the same conversation as last night. It was the same words arranged into something heavier, because now she had watched it, both hands on the glass and all. "That is what your people do," she said. "You are afraid, and you choose anyway. And then you shake. After. And that is the evidence that you understood what you were choosing." She set my hand down gently, on my own knee, stood up, stepped back, the princess distance, the appropriate space resuming. "I did not have a word for that," she said. "I think I do now." "What word?" I said. She said something in Vathri, 2 syllables, and my translator did not have it, because it was new. "What does it mean?" I said. She looked at the 4 guards, and then at me, and there was something in her face that was not regal, and not diplomatic, and was not bothering to pretend to be either. "It means," she said carefully, finding the English words for something that had not been in English before, "a person who walks into the fire, not because they do not feel the heat, but because someone is inside." I did not have anything to say to that. I held it the way you hold something you know is going to matter for a long time, by not examining it too closely right away, by letting it sit where it landed. Seth handed me something. I looked down. It was a water ration from the transport supplies, which I had not known I needed until I was holding it. I drank it. Keth sat near me. The shaking in my hands was already slowing down. Outside, the stars were the same stars they always were, but the room they were in was different. The UN rescue frigate arrived 14 hours later. I was asleep on the transport floor. Not the bay, not the airlock junction, not the pilot's seat. The floor of the corridor near the engine room, which was where I had been checking something and had sat down for a moment and apparently not gotten back up. The amber light was back. The repair cycle must have reset. I woke up and Seth was sitting near me. I did not know when that had started. The comms told me about the frigate, command frequency, formal identification, the machinery of military rescue clicking into its practiced sequence. I answered it and gave my status, and got the standard set of instructions that meant, "You are found, you are extracted, return to the protocol." The protocol was that I transferred back to my own chain of command, and the Vathri diplomatic situation was handled through the appropriate channels, which meant a different set of people entirely. I went back to the bay and ran a final check on the Halcyon, more out of habit than necessity, and when I turned around, all 4 of the Cathara guard were there. Tail, Vane, the 4th guard, whose name was Sarai, who had told me this quietly during the night, while bringing me something to eat, and had said it with the particular care of someone who had decided that this was a thing they wanted me to know. Keth. They stood in a line, which was not quite their guard formation, and not quite at ease. Something in between, a formation they were making up for the occasion. Vane moved first. He extended his right hand with the palm out toward me, which I recognized from the database as a Vathri gesture of formal acknowledgement, the gesture that means I name you known. It was not a greeting. It was a classification, a permanent addition. It meant he was putting me into a category of things that counted. I did not have a matching gesture. I reached out and touched his palm with mine, which seemed like the closest equivalent, and whatever it meant in Vathri terms, he accepted it. Sarai did the same. Then something slightly different. A tap on the back of my hand with 2 fingers, which Tail told me later was a junior guard's mark of respect given to a senior fighter, and which Sarai technically was not allowed to give someone outside the guard structure, but which she had apparently decided was appropriate anyway. Seth did not do the palm gesture. He reached into his armor and removed something and put it in my hand and closed my fingers around it. It was a Cathara Guard insignia chip, the rank token of an active guard member, the physical credential that identified the bearer as belonging to that order. I looked at it. I looked at him. His expression did not change. He simply looked at me with the look of a man who had already decided what he thought and saw no reason to defend it. Tail stepped forward. He straightened, and the gesture that followed was a formal Vathri military salute, not the casual version, not the acknowledgement version, the full form. I had seen it described in the database as reserved for the dead and for things that carried the weight of ceremony. He held it for 3 full seconds, which in Vathri timing was a long time. "I will be filing a combat report," he said. The analysis portion, the tactical section, was straightforward. "You did something that our doctrine does not account for. and the outcome was a result our models would not have predicted, and I have written both of those things plainly, and without embellishment, because the plain facts are more interesting than embellishment." He paused. The classification section gave me difficulty. There was no existing category in V3 military taxonomy for what you represented. "That's all right," I said. "I invented one," he said. I waited. "Anchor," he said. "A thing that holds when everything else moves. A fixed point in a situation where fixed points should not exist." He looked at me the way he had looked at me on the floor of the airlock junction, level and direct. "We did not have the word before. We have it now. Because of today. Because of you." I held that for a moment. "I hope you don't mind," he said, which landed with a slight undercurrent of dry humor that I had not heard from him before, and which made me revise my estimate of him upward significantly. "I don't mind," I said. "The princess came last." Of course she did. She walked in with the same quality she always had, purposeful and composed, and stopped at the distance that was correct for her station, and gave me the formal V3 diplomatic farewell, the full version with both of the closing gestures, precisely correct. Then she leaned close enough that only I could hear. She said, in the careful broken English she had been practicing from the translation database, "You shook, after." I watched. "I know," I said quietly. "That means you were afraid." She looked at me from this close, and the measuring look was entirely gone, and what was in its place was something I did not have a word for either. "That means you chose anyway." A pause. "Humans are very strange." She stepped back. Princess distance. Formal register. The correct composure for a diplomatic departure. "And we are very glad," she said, just barely, looking at me, "that you answered the beacon." She left, and Tail followed, and Sarai, and Vane. Seth paused at the door. He looked back at me once, the direct Seth look that asked and answered nothing simultaneously, and then he was gone too. I stood in the bay with the insignia chip in my hand. I put it in my chest pocket, against the sternum. Where you put things you are not ready to explain. The frigate debrief took 4 hours. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Owen Price, was a serious man who asked serious questions and who had the particular expression of someone who had received a report before the conversation and was now checking it against the source. I gave him the same answers I had given the Cathara Guard, shorter, because military debriefs prefer the short version. He wrote things down and asked follow-up questions and did not editorialize. At the end, he looked at his notes and then at me. "The V3 diplomatic team filed a contact report through their standard channel," he said. "It contained a tactical analysis by the guard commander. It also contained a personal supplemental note from Princess Sail Vin, marked as informal and not for official record." I waited. "She described the engagement and your role in it," Price said. The formal language was appropriate and measured. He looked at me over the notes. The supplemental note was less formal. "What did it say?" He read it. He had the expression of a man reading something that was not what he expected to be reading, and who was managing that without showing it particularly well. Then he set the notes down and said, "She said, they know what it costs. They do it anyway. I do not have a word for that yet, but I will find one." I thought about the word she had said the morning after the second fight, the one my translator had not had yet, the one that meant a person who walks into the fire not because they do not feel the heat, but because someone is inside. "She found one," I said. Price looked at me. Then he nodded, once, the practical nod of a man closing a topic. "New orders incoming," he said. "Sector assignment confirmed. You'll receive the coordinates in the hour." "Understood." "Cole." He said it in the way that meant he was saying something outside the debrief, the informal voice that officers sometimes found after the official business was closed. "Whatever you did out there, however you did it." He looked at the notes. The V3 Security Council forwarded a recommendation to the UN Diplomatic Office. They want a human liaison attached to their compact delegation, with specific reference to the engagement at Grid 7. He set the notes on the desk. They used the word anchor class in the formal recommendation. I did not say anything. "Apparently," Price said, "they invented the category." He dismissed me, and I walked back through the frigate to the bay where the Halcyon was docked, and I ran a pre-flight check that I did not technically need to run yet, because I needed to do something with my hands. The Halcyon looked like she had been through a significant amount of difficulty recently, which she had, and she sounded like an engine that had made several structural compromises in service of an outcome and was prepared to discuss the receipts. I patted the hull plating in the section Seth had watched me repair, which is not a normal thing to do to a spacecraft but which felt appropriate. She held together. She always did. The new sector coordinates came through while I was in the pilot's seat. I pulled them up. New grid. Not adjacent to my old assignment. Not close to V3 space. Somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the UN needed a scout-class corvette and a sergeant they could assign to a position too far out for anyone with options to volunteer for. I sat with the coordinates for 4 seconds. Then I checked the passive detection band. Old habit now. The quiet alarm rather than the loud one. No contacts. Clean space in every direction the scanner could reach. Somewhere behind me, in V3 space, a princess was writing a word that had not existed 4 days ago. Filing reports that contained a new classification. Teaching a language something it had not needed before today. Somewhere ahead, the new sector waited with whatever it had in it. I thought about the 4 seconds before Grid 7. I thought about the beacon on the wrong frequency, in the wrong grid, in the sector that was not mine to worry about. I thought about Seth sitting near me on the floor. I thought about 2 hands on a viewport glass. I thought about the thing that had changed, somewhere in the 11 hours between the first fight and the second one. The thing that had shifted without announcement. How I had gone out to fight the Sunder Pack and the calculation was different than the one before it. Not lower probability. Not higher stakes. Different starting point. The first time I had fought because there was no one else. The second time I had fought because there were people I did not want to lose. That was new. That was the thing I was going to carry in the same pocket as the insignia chip, against the sternum, in the place where you put things that are too important to explain, and too new to touch, and too real to leave anywhere but close. The fold drive spun up. The stars went long in the way they went when the universe was being crossed at speed, stretching to lines and then to nothing, and then to the elsewhere that fold space moved through. I thought about anchor, about what it meant to be the fixed point, about the weight of holding when everything moved. I thought that for someone who had spent 211 days with nothing to hold on to, it was a strange and serious thing to become. The fold completed. New sector, new grid, new stars, identical to the old ones in the ways that mattered. I ran my detection band. Quiet. For now. I adjusted the passive alarm to its lowest sensitivity setting and sat back and waited. The way you wait when you have learned that waiting is part of the work. That the silence between signals is not absence but preparation. Somewhere out there, on a frequency I had not been assigned to monitor, in a grid that was no one's responsibility until it was, a beacon might begin to broadcast. 4 seconds was all it would take. It always was.